Hey guys, and welcome back to another video on my channel. So lately I have been really interested in cults, and so I wanted to talk about a cult with you guys today on my channel. However, I didn't want to talk about one of the cults that is talked about all the time. I did Jonestown in the past, which obviously is one of the more talked about cults, but I wanted to pick one that I haven't seen a million times on the internet. So I was racking my brain trying to think of something that I could talk about, and that is when I remembered way back when I used to be obsessed with River Phoenix, and I have very strong feelings about his death, which I could make a whole video on if you guys are interested in. But then I remembered that River Phoenix and Joaquin Phoenix were in a cult for a period of time when they were very, very young, and that cult was extremely twisted and dark, and I remember looking into it briefly when I was really interested in River Phoenix, and so I decided to dive into that cult today and make a video about it, and oh boy is it ever twisted. So with that all being said, let's get right into today's video. Today we are going to be talking about the cult known as Children of God. This cult was originally known as Teens for Christ, and it was founded in 1968 in Huntington Beach by a man by the name of David Berg. Now, what is so messed up about this cult, besides all of the stuff that we are going to talk about throughout today's video, is that this cult actually still exists today. So let's talk about David's young life to start. So when David was young, his mother was very into spiritualism. She was very much a spiritualist. She really believed in spiritual healing, and his entire family was really into the Pentecostal movement. When David was 6 years old, that is when his family had packed up and they would be moving to Miami. And when the family got to Miami, that is when they would start the Berg's Evangelist Dramatics company. And in this company, his dad really focused on like music and things along those lines, and his mother was a preacher. So this entire thing was kind of like, they were like preaching throughout this entire thing, and they just made it really musical, and it was really like based around Christianity, but mixed with like spiritualism and music and all of that kind of stuff. So people really did like this, and a lot of people really did come out and join this company that they had created. This mix between music and faith is something that David really liked, and he would end up taking this with him for the rest of his life into his cult that he would later on create. When David grew up, he tried to stay within the church. He worked as a minister for a period, but was eventually asked to leave because of multiple sexual misconduct allegations that kept coming up. He then tried to work after this in other areas of the church, but the same kind of things kept happening, and it never ended up working out. At this time, David's mother was much older, and she was now preaching to kind of like hippie teens. That was the majority of the people that she was preaching to, and so David decided to join her along in doing this, and that was something that I guess he really enjoyed and he thrived in. When David's mother had passed, he really started to expand this group, and that is when he named the group Teens for Christ. And at this time, David was really preaching love and peace and all of those good things that cults usually preach about at the beginning before they have too much control. And as this group continued to grow and grow and grow, David would eventually change the name to Children of God. Now, something crazy is that David strongly believed that the apocalypse was coming, and he started to preach this to his followers, saying that if you were a member of the Children of God, you would be going straight to heaven. He claimed that this apocalypse would be happening in 1993. At this point, the group had about 200 members, and they would all travel across the country to gather new members and preach the word about the apocalypse and what they believed in, which obviously sounded very, very good to a lot of people, which would end up growing this church very, very quickly. Now, something to note here is that a lot of, actually a majority of, the members of the Children of God, when they joined the cult, they were very heavy drug users. Now, this would obviously make their mental state a bit weaker, but once they joined the cult, then they found God, and they were no longer using these drugs. Members of the Children of God were not allowed to use drugs, they were not allowed to smoke, you were not allowed to drink, you were not allowed to kiss, hug, have any sexual contact with anybody. Marriage was allowed, but it had to be within the church, and the marriage had to be approved of by the older members of the Children of God community. I keep referring to it as a church. I don't really know if that's like, I guess like acceptable, but I'm probably going to continue to do it just because it feels natural coming out of my mouth. But I do just need to verify that this is a cult. As this group was growing and growing, David decided that all of the members should live together. All of the members decided to move to what was an abandoned Bible camp in Texas, and they called this the Soul Clinic. And as you can probably imagine, life there was not the easiest. The members had full days on hours of Bible study and prayer each day, and on top of that, each member of the cult had kind of like their own set of chores that they had to do each day. And while researching this cult, I was also researching like cults in general, and I found that when you're extremely tired and sleep deprived, it does make your brain easier to manipulate, and it makes you easier to control, which is why in so many of these cult situations, the members of the cult are quite literally run into the ground. They are woken up at crazy hours, and they are expected to start, praying, studying the Bible, working, and then they don't go to bed till late hours of the evening, and they have like these distracting sounds going on at night to keep them awake and like whatever, and that is because that is a manipulation tactic. Many of the members of the Children of God cult, again, were young adults, and a lot of these young adults, like I already mentioned, were heavy drug users. They didn't come from the best backgrounds. They were really trying to rebel. They came from really bad situations. They weren't close with their families, or they had bad relationships with their families because of their behavior prior to joining the cult. And it is stated by a lot of these people that once they joined the Children of God, they really found like a sense of belonging, and they found like a sense of wanting to do better, and they no longer felt the need to rebel, and they didn't have any issues with helping with the chores or doing anything like that around the camp that they were living at. They really enjoyed it, and it really changed their lives, which is crazy given the circumstances.
I was trying to love before, but I was so full of hatred and everything for society that I just didn't know what real love was. And now that I've got real love, and now that I really know how I can help people, I just don't need to go down and burn down buildings anymore, or hang around with freaks, or I don't need to run through crowds and kiss black people to make the society see what they're doing. I don't need to ride motorcycles just for the feeling of freedom and power anymore.
In the group, there was no such thing as private property, and upon joining the group, members had to sign off all of their personal belongings so that everybody in the group could use it. This includes children. If you had a child and you joined the Children of God, or if you were already a member of the Children of God and you had a child, this was now the entire cult's child. It was not your child. On top of that, they really only ate food that was donated to them or it was about to expire, so like grocery stores and restaurants and stuff had thrown it out, and somebody would go and get it and bring it to the group, and that is really how they ate. They didn't have any money to go out and buy their own food because the cult was told that working for money was against God. And like I said about watching these videos before, I was watching this video about the cult from 1972, and I think it was like a promotional video because they only really said good things about the cult. But while watching this video, you can really see that the people who were in the Children of God really believed that they were doing the absolute 100% right thing. And the passion that these people have, like you can see it in the video, is absolutely crazy.
Have a good time, serving the Lord. Have a good time.
When the group wasn't in Bible study or they weren't doing their chores, they would get into these very large tour buses and they would travel across the country, and that is where they would try and recruit new members for the cult. However, the difference between this cult and some other cults that I've read about is their main focus was recruiting young people. So they would go to concert halls, music festivals, the beach, bars, places like that where young people would really flock, and that is where they would kind of preach their word and try and gather new members. This church was growing so extremely quickly that at this point they had over 10,000 members and 70 communes just across America. However, that wasn't the only set of members, as this cult ended up growing so large that it is actually worldwide. Now, because there are so many members in the Children of God, David obviously couldn't communicate with them just by word of mouth or by the phone, so he started to send out what he called Mo letters. Now, he called these Mo letters because he made the members of the Children of God refer to him as Mo David, like Moses or King David, but Mo David was more of what he went by. Now, these letters were like newsletters that he would send out, and they would basically say like, you know, the practices of the church and things along those lines. But what was going out in these Mo letters was actually pretty twisted. Oh, I don't know if there was always something sketchy about all of the Mo letters, but one of the Mo letters that I came across online while researching for this case was a Mo letter about flirty fishing. Now, flirty fishing was something that was very, very common within the cult. David's number one priority at this time was to recruit more people to join the Children of God. And so he had this plan, or this method, I guess you would call it, that he called flirty fishing, where he would send out women who were a part of the cult, whether they were married or not, and he would have them seduce men in order to manipulate these men into joining the Children of God. Now, what would later come up by members of the Children of God or ex-members of the Children of God is that this technique actually worked, and many of these women altogether recruited hundreds of thousands of new members using this flirty fishing method. The kids in the Children of God cult were not allowed to have an education, or I guess they just were not educated. David did not see this as needed. He didn't think that this was important at all, especially with the end of the world approaching. He just didn't see why this would be necessary for the children to be educated. Listen to this. The members of the cult were not permitted to be alone. Ever. Not in the shower, not while they were sleeping, and not if you just wanted alone time. Now, the reason that David inflicted this or pushed this rule was because he thought that if one person started to kind of trail off, if there was a second person there, they could bring this person back into line, or they could tell David so that David could bring this person back into line. David, again, like I mentioned earlier in the video, really took this music and faith thing that his father and his mother were so interested in and brought that with him into his group. Now, with this, he would create a lot of commercials that would be aired on TV in the 80s, and a lot of these commercials were preaching David's method through song. And you can find a lot of these videos on YouTube. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to include them in this video as for copyright strikes and things like that, but I'm going to try. But if I can't, you can find them on YouTube. As time went on, the beliefs of the group really started to change, and what was allowed within the Children of God really shifted from what was originally allowed. David was really into this free love movement as he was preaching since the beginning. However, at the beginning, you weren't allowed to do anything. You weren't allowed to hug, kiss, everything that I mentioned earlier on. But at this time, David was really pushing that women's only job in the entire world was to please men. And the girls in the cult were beginning to get taught this at a younger and younger age. On top of that, things really started to shift, and David started to really encourage incestual relationships and adult children sexual relationships. Also, on top of that, he also encouraged many men in the group to have multiple wives. Now, when this all started to come to light, that is when several members of the cult started to wake up and realize that something was very, very wrong here, and they needed to get their families away from this group. Something else to note here is because everybody in the Children of God was just kind of sleeping with everyone on the commune, there was like several STD outbreaks that I came across while researching this cult in like that time when that was really being pushed. There was like so many STDs floating around all of these communes. And that is again really, really different from the beginning when the cult had just started, because again, you weren't even allowed to kiss or hug or anything like that. And now you're allowed to sleep with everybody without any, like there's no rules at all. Like even insane. David's number one priority was still to continue to keep growing his cult, so he saw this as an opportunity. So he started to encourage the members of the cult to have a lot of unprotected sex, and he encouraged the members of the cult to have as many children as possible. That way he would continue to gain more and more followers, but that way many children were just continuing to be born in these terribly abusive conditions. American actress Rosie Mcgowan was born into the Children of God cult, and she is very vocal about her experience in the cult and what it was like living in these conditions. And she said that once the cult started to allow child abuse, that is when her family really woke up and realized something was wrong, and that is when they decided to get away from this group. I already mentioned earlier on in the video, River and Joaquin Phoenix, along with their parents and all of their siblings, were all also members of the Children of God, and they traveled across the world with them in the 70s. But once the Phoenix family discovered that what the cult was preaching was very, very different from what they were actually allowing from their members, they decided that this wasn't something that they wanted to be a part of, and they got out as well. But something to note here is that River Phoenix did not leave the cult without facing abuse, as he had mentioned in one of his interviews that he was born into the Children of God cult and that he had lost his virginity at the age of 4. Around this time too, word was spreading that David Berg and his followers in the Children of God were allowing child abuse to go on within the cult, and that word spread, and this led to a lot of pedophiles joining the cult just to abuse the children that were there. Once this word really got out, obviously David Berg was a very hated and wanted man, but he actually ended up passing away in 1994 while on the run, which you would think would be a good thing because you would think that that would bring all of this to an end, right? However, that is not the case. Karen Zornby had joined the cult at a very early time. Actually, it was so early on when she had joined the cult that it was only about 100 people who were members of the Children of God at this time. And if you remember, at this time, the cult was really preaching something different than what they were preaching today. You weren't even allowed to kiss, let alone do all of this really vile stuff that they were promoting now. Karen and David became extremely close, and Karen even started to work as David's personal secretary. The two of them eventually started to have an affair, and David would eventually take Karen as his second wife, and that is when he started to encourage sharing. After this, Karen had a lot of influence on David and the cult itself, and around this time she would continue to David to sleep with more women, so he would sleep with more women. And at this time, he also started to sleep with his own granddaughter, who was extremely young at the time. So, like I mentioned, Karen had a lot of influence in the cult, and she was even known by the cult members as Mother Mary. She would help David write his Mo letters as he got older and couldn't do so anymore, and so when David passed away, she took his place as the cult leader. Karen would go on to run this cult with her new husband, Stephen Kelly. However, when David had passed away, a lot of the members of the Children of God had decided to leave, and with this happening, the cult was growing smaller and smaller. And this was not making Karen very happy, so she decided that she was going to allow more freedom within the cult. You are now allowed to marry outside of the Children of God. You are also allowed to send your children to school, and you are also allowed to work normal 9-to-5 jobs. When Karen took over the cult, she would start to incorporate some of her own beliefs and her own practices, and one of these was loving Jesus, which, as far as I can tell online, is where you sit and imagine yourself being intimate with Jesus. Many of the ex-members of the Children of God cult have come out and spoke to the public about what they went through, and mental health issues, drug abuse, things along those lines are very, very common in ex-members of the Children of God, as well as suicide due to the conditions and the abuse that many of the people had faced while living in this cult. Should verify that the Children of God's name actually changed several times. In 1978, it changed to the Family of Love, and then in 1982, they changed the name from the Family of Love to just the Family, and today the cult is known as the Family International. It still exists, and it is still run by Karen and her husband. Now, allegedly, the Flirty Fishing is gone, and they no longer allow child abuse within the cult. Now, that's great and all. However, Karen was said to have a lot of power when David was alive, so clearly she is okay with that stuff that was going on, as well as many of the members who were members back then are still members today, so you can't say that they don't think that that is okay, because clearly they do if they stayed with the cult that long. And on top of that, where are they getting new members? Who would research this or look into this and see all of the child abuse allegations and things along those lines that this organization has against it and go, I'm gonna join that organization? Like, the fact that this still exists is just absolutely, like, how does it still exist? If you guys are still interested in finding out more about this cult, you can find interviews all over Google and YouTube of former members of the Children of God sitting down and talking about their experiences within the cult. One in particular interview, or one woman I guess, that I want to talk about is a woman by the name of Dawn Watson, and you can find several interviews with her all over YouTube where she talks about her experience. But I did want to focus on her because one of the interviews that I watched of her, she talks about how a lot of the women and just the parents who had had their children in this cult really thought that they were doing the best thing for their child at that time. They really didn't see any issues with it. Now, luckily for Dawn, she was born into the cult, but she ended up escaping when she was much older, which is good. I mean, obviously you don't want to stay stuck in something like that. But she goes on to say that like having sex was taught to you as a young child, like brushing your teeth. Like it was that common. Talks about how the abuse that was going on wasn't like you might think. It wasn't in your face, and it wasn't like extremely like violent and shoved down your throat. It was extremely hush hush. This would happen to you and then you would be told not to talk about it. On top of that, she said that it was so engraved in your brain at such a young age that this was love, that she really thought, or that many of the children in the cult really thought, that when adults had done this to them, that was them expressing God's love. Interviews are very, very interesting. I also watched several interviews from other people who were ex-members of the Children of God cult that I highly recommend you guys look into. I will link some of them in the description box down below. But guys, that's going to bring us to the end of today's video. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up. Don't forget to comment down below what you'd like to see in my future videos, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on that notification bell so that you don't miss any future videos from me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.